This is my Humankind Ancient Era Cultures tier list. These are the pieces of criteria that I'm going to be comparing cultures against. I'm also going to discuss them in more detail in the concluding part of this video, but this is going to be a beefy one. We've got 10 Ancient Era cultures to go through, and I'm going to be comparing them with this tier list, but also I'm going to have gameplay for each and every single one of them. I painstakingly gathered gameplay across all of them for you to enjoy, to keep those eyeballs interested. If that doesn't deserve a like rating, I don't know what does. But anyway, without any further ado, we've got a big task ahead of us, so let's jump straight in. And in alphabetical order, first and foremost, we're looking at the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians are the only expansionist culture in humankind's ancient era, which gives them a slight edge. However, let's talk about what they do. Their legacy trait gives them +1 land movement speed on all units, and it's important to note, I'll say this once but not again, that you keep legacy traits from any culture throughout the rest of the game. This is the one thing that will stick with you alongside any emblematic districts that you've built. So when we're assessing these, we have to remember that these legacy traits stay with us through the whole game. Anyway, their emblematic unit is pretty good. It's the Assyrian Raider. It's quite fast and fairly strong, and their emblematic district is the Danu. It's kind of like an upgraded garrison. You get a little bit of extra influence from it, and you get district fortification. The beauty of it is also that you don't lose stability, unlike most districts, and you can place it wherever you want. Overall, I actually think that the Assyrians are better than we give them credit for, particularly with recent changes to how expansionist cultures work. You now see really clearly that you get fame and era stars from connecting cities into your territory. It combos somewhat reasonably with their Danu, which provides you with influence, the vital resource you need to expand and earn those stars. Also, the extra land movement speed is really useful, not just for your Assyrian riders, which are already fairly quick, but also it combos with the fact that you're an expansionist culture, and you can therefore cross into other territories without needing open borders or declaring war, and of course you can forcibly annex territories and take control of them for yourself. That's been buffed recently too. Overall, the Assyrians, with recent changes to the expansionist ability, and the fact that their district and unit combine reasonably well and they're fairly synergetic, actually put them in a place where I didn't think I'd be placing them on a tier list. I'm going to put them at the A level. They are an A grade culture, where B is my average, S tier is the absolute greatest, C is slightly below average, and then I have this fail category at the bottom. And I think that overall, the synergy of the Assyrians, the broad usefulness, viability of the Assyrians, and the fact that their stars are actually quite easy to earn now, places them at comfortably an above average A grade. Next up are the Babylonians. These bad boys are the only scientific culture in the ancient era. They provide +2 science per research technology for the rest of the game. They are brilliant philosophers. The emblematic unit is not particularly fast, but it's fairly strong, and it's a guardian unit as well, which will be useful because you're probably going to be, or at least you should be, playing more defensively as Babylon. Their emblematic district is where they really shine. It's the astronomy house. It provides +3 science per adjacent farmer's quarter. So it's a quarter you can build quickly, and it's the best adjacency bonus you can get in this stage at +3. It also gives you +1 food per researcher and 1 science per researcher and an additional research slot. It's a very powerful astronomy house that combos well with the sort of agrarian nature of the early game and those farmers' quarters. Overall, Babylon is a fairly easy one to play. As a scientific culture in the very early stages of Humankind Game, you're probably less likely to be using their collective minds. And for that reason, and that, by the way, is largely because you're probably going to want to be building things in your cities rather than using the collective mind's ability. For that reason, they're a little bit more limited than some of the later game scientific cultures, and you are trading things off if you choose to focus solely on science. However, the fact that they combo with food, I think, is their saving grace. Also, you can research technologies in the next era as a scientific culture. That makes Babylon, while not perfectly synergized, a fairly versatile, powerful, wide-reaching culture in the ancient era. I very nearly put them at S tier, but I think just the fact that they do have a couple of weak spots, like the fact that collective minds is not very useful, like the fact that they don't have any great means of producing industry, which is a vital asset in the early game. Likewise, influence, they're missing that too. For those reasons, I'm going to place them as an A tier, but in my mind, I would place them ahead of the Assyrians. So I'll stack them ahead, and throughout the rest of the video, that's how I'll demonstrate that, by the way. Next up, we have the Egyptians, and any player familiar with Humankind will know that these Egyptians, man, they are powerful. These guys are powerful. So, they are the only industrial culture in the base game of Humankind's ancient era. As the only builder culture, that means they're the only way that you can get pride, which increases stability when you build new districts, very powerful. Also land raiser, which is kind of like collective mind for scientists, but for the industrialists. I argue that land raiser, unlike collective minds, is more of a useful ability. It converts your science and money and surplus food into industry. This is useful even in the very early stages. Their legacy trait, and this is the thing that stays with you forever, is +1 industry on tiles producing industry already, and a -10% cost for producing industry districts. A district industry cost, sorry, so actually that's all districts for future. Their emblematic unit is both strong and fast. It's a ranged unit, so take that what you will, less good. It's mounted as well, so can't really climb walls so much, but potentially better at defending. It's also very fast, which will help your early game discovery. Combine that with their very, very powerful Egyptian pyramid. This is their emblematic district. +3 industry and +3 industry further for adjacent Maker's Quarter. That's insane. It's the best adjacency you can get, and it's the best base yield you can get for industry. It also gives you +1 influence, which will help your early game expansion in claiming territories and connecting them up. Overall, once you even get something as simple as the garrison unlocked, and you just go Maker's Quarter garrison at a very basic level, you can do a lot better than that with the Egyptians. But at the very basic level, that's the way how you can scale them. They are perfectly synergetic. They give you arguably the two most useful yields in the ancient era. That is influence to take territories, build cities, and connect things, and industry. Crucial for getting not just your emblematic districts online, but also all of your city infrastructure, festivals if you really get bored, building units as well. Honestly, the Egyptians do what you need to do in the early game, and they do it so very well. It would be criminally unjust of me to place them anywhere other than S tier, best tier. Next up, we have a culture you may not have got to play much. Indeed, I struggled to play them. I re-rolled, I think, 7 times to get a game, and it was literally just a 1v1 map to get a game where the AI didn't pick the Harappans and beat me to getting a culture. So, take that what you will. Anyway, what do the Harappans do? Well, for those who haven't played them, they are the only agrarian culture, the food culture, in Humankind's ancient era. Their legacy trait gives you, in similar ways to what the Egyptians give you for industry, the Harappans give you for food. You'll see that as a common theme, but there are some key differences. Anyway, they have fertile inundations as their legacy trait, +1 food on tiles that are already producing food. Here's looking at you, rivers. But wait, there's more rivers, because you'll also get +1 food on river. That is, river as a whole, by the way, I believe. A careful distinction in Humankind between tiles and whole features. Most of the time it refers to tiles, sometimes it refers to whole features, but either way, +1 food on tiles producing food, and that +1 benefit if you've got the river as well, you're looking sweet for food, but it doesn't stop there. Their emblematic district provides +3 food, and again, that massive +3 adjacency bonus per farmer's quarter. It's the same as the Babylonians, but full focus on food. And no science. Maybe slightly worse, but man, the canal network scales rapidly. When you get it, particularly on tiles that are already producing food, on rivers, you get your basic infrastructure in place. The Harappans gain such an incredible amount of food that you'll get so many populations that you can then fill into jobs to get other yields. Your populations can be working on industry jobs or science jobs. further spurred along by in-game infrastructures within your cities. Also, of course, if you decide to completely change tack down the line, you can turn your population into buildings by expending them, sorry guys, or turn them into units. Having a huge base of population in a city is never a bad thing because you can always, particularly in the early game, convert them into other metrics. Population is just as useful of a resource in Humankind's early game. It's also important to note that as an agrarian culture, they get increased city stability as a one-off when cities gain populations, and they have a kind of a not necessarily very useful, but kind of fun and a bit cheesy affinity trait. As an agrarian culture, you can use Land of Plenty once every 5 turns to use influence to steal population from an adjacent territory. By and large, this isn't overly useful. You can kind of annoy your opponents a bit with it more than anything. But if you do manage to take population from neutral tribes, you can potentially reduce their cities to 0 pop and then walk straight in and take them. It's a cheese factor, and I'm getting distracted. The Harappans are not only the only agrarian culture in the early game, in the ancient era, but man, they are a fantastic one. I should also mention their emblematic unit, which is oft forgotten. It's called runners. This is actually a really great unit because it upgrades immediately from your nomadic units. You don't need to spend any money, you don't need to spend nothing. It automatically upgrades from your tribal units. You get a little bit of extra movement, a little bit of extra strength. Honestly, it's a free upgrade. It's a fairly powerful one in that regard, and you'll be able to expand across the world that little bit quicker with that little bit of extra movement straight away. Overall, the Harappans, I do not believe, are as good as the Egyptians. I believe they are closer in strength to the Babylonians and the Assyrians. However, just because they are the only agrarian culture and they can set your game up so well with +1 food on tiles producing food, it would be unjust of me to not put them at that S tier level. Next up, we have, actually, interestingly, another culture you may not have played much before, but for very different reasons. Yikes. These are the Hittites. This is the Hittites. They are a militarist culture in Humankind Game's ancient era, one of 2 militarists. So you have a little bit more flexibility here within this category, important to bear in mind. As a militarist, they can raise militia armies from cities, sometimes a useful ability to raise up some peasants for free, essentially. And vigilance increases your base war support value. This is good if you get caught out, but if you're going to war, I often find that unless I'm looking to wrap up a war particularly quickly, this is less useful. If I'm the aggressor, chances are I think I can win the war, and therefore the extra war support is less useful. That's a more broader comment about the militarist affinity trait, though. Let's remember what we're doing here. We are reviewing the Hittites. Their legacy trait is called Lust for War. You will receive +1 combat strength for the rest of the game on all of your units. It's a nice little buff. If it was +2, I would be like, hey, that's good. At +1, I'm still interested in it, but let's be real, that is the same benefit as basically me building the first infrastructural upgrade that provides additional experience to units when you train them. So it's important to put that into context. Yes, it snowballs with that, absolutely. But when we're evaluating its base strength, that is the base strength level of this ability. Their emblematic unit is naturally very good. 23 combat strength and 6 movement. That has it roughly on par with the Egyptians, but arguably a little bit more versatile. Their emblematic district, the Awari, is distinct. Let's put it that way. It automatically upgrades from regular outposts. So this is not a district that you'll build in your cities. Or outposts, in fact. When you build an outpost, it is an Awari. Your outposts are these districts, so you don't actually need to go into any special length to construct them. The downside of this, before I discuss what it actually is, the downside is that when you create your cities, you don't have any sort of powerful must build. There is no Egyptian pyramid. There is no Harappan food canal. There is no Zhou Confucian school. There isn't that one thing that you must build that instantly provides you with a huge boost. And that's a real downside. But let's talk about the upsides for this district. So, as I say, the Awari upgrades from the regular outpost. So as soon as you spam down an outpost, you're actually spamming down these Awaris. They really, the key benefit from them, apart from acting like a garrison and providing you with some additional strength, and of course the fact that because you're placing them down as outposts, you can place them down wherever you want, so you can place them down somewhat aggressively, is their key ability, and that is the fact that they can be used as a unit land spawn for neighbouring cities. So what you can do is build a city, expand aggressively to a territory near your opponent, place down the Awari near their border, and then you can instantly build units in a neighbouring territory city and spawn them on the Awari. This is nice, but actually you can do that with a garrison anyway if you attach the outpost to the neighbouring city. So all this is really doing is providing you with a free garrison in an outpost where you don't have to attach the outpost to build the garrison there. It's good, but is it comparable to any of these? Unfortunately, Hittite fans, I argue no. You are really not getting a great deal of benefit, and when we move into our next culture, you'll see why. The Hittites, I'm afraid, actually will receive less than a C grade from me here. They are not just below average, they are considerably below average, and for that reason, I'm putting them in the fail tier. Sorry, Hittite friends. It's just not there. You're just not there. Next up, we have humankind's second ancient era and final ancient era military culture. It's the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans, of course, as a militarist, receive the same things that the Hittites do in that sort of base affinity level. You can raise militia armies and have higher war support. It's okay. In the later game, more useful. In the ancient era, maybe not so much. Their legacy trait, though, is very different and much better, actually. Minus 20% on unit industry costs, so for the rest of the game, you can produce your units for 20% less production, and 25% additional experience on creating units on cities or outposts. In many ways, this is very similar to the +1 combat strength that the Hittites got, because when your units receive that extra experience, they'll be much closer to, if not already receiving a promotion, and that promotion will give them +1 combat strength, even more if you're scaling stuff in the later game. So basically, you're kind of getting the Hittites +1 combat strength with this extra unit experience, but you're also producing units 20% cheaper. Their emblematic unit is a little bit weaker. It's not a mounted unit, so you don't get that additional movement, but it's strong. And crucially here, something that you don't maybe quite realize unless you've played the Mycenaeans, is that their unique unit replaces the very first melee unit that you get the same time you get that very first technology that unlocks garrisons and warriors and so on. So you can get these units really fast. You don't need the wheel like you need for a lot of mounted chariot units. So you can pump out your emblematic unit, the promochoi's pronunciation help needed, very quickly. Furthermore, you can do this because actually the Mycenaeans have a useful emblematic district, and man, not is it only useful in context with the Awari that the Hittites have, but actually this district is arguably one of the best ones in the era. The Cyclopean Fortress provides +20 fortification. That makes it the strongest fortification you can build in the ancient era. It also, unlike the other garrison districts which just provide fortification, and +3 combat strength for this one for units in or adjacent to it, so it's also a great forward war post. Much better than the Awari. Again, I hate to harp back on the Awari. I'll stop doing that now because this district, the Cyclopean Fortress, gets even better still. It's not just a great defensive post. It's not just a great forward war post and unit spawn, but also it provides +3 industry and +15 stability. The adjacency bonuses and benefits you can get from this thing often means, in reality, it actually provides +15 stability and around +15 industry from the very beginning. And you can see that I'm able to achieve this in my gameplay easily across many cities. This district, therefore, is an industry powerhouse, as well as providing stability, which will allow you to grow a bit more. Overall, the only thing that the Mycenaeans are missing is some way to get influence faster. They don't have any great way to explore the map super quickly unless you want to raise some militia armies and send them out. It's a little bit gamey, but you could do it. But otherwise, they have a really powerful industry base, and crucially, as a militarist culture, they do what they should do, and they do it very well. You can get your early unit, your powerful unit, very quickly, with extra experience at a reduced cost, supported by a very powerful and aggressive Cyclopean fortress that further adds industry to your cities. The Mycenaeans are actually a really powerful, top-tier humankind culture. So powerful that when I was planning this video, I moved them in between two of these rankings many times. I'm going to rank the Mycenaeans at a high A. A very high A. Honestly, on par with the Babylonians would be where I would put their strength. The only reason for me that they don't quite make it to the S tier is because, unlike these S tier cultures, which are always good, let's take the Egyptians. Industry is always good. You need to build units to quickly defend yourself, you can do it. You want to play SimCity or City Skylines and build up a wonderful city, you can do that too. It's infinitely flexible and arguably more viable. Whereas the Mycenaeans are wonderful, but if you're not warring with them, you're arguably not really living up to their benefits. And because not every game and not every player will be built for war, either because that might not be your thing, or the map simply might not allow for it. You might be isolated on an island and unable to leave, for example. For that reason, they just miss the versatility that is required to be an S tier. And so for that reason, I'm putting them at an A tier. But I just want to acknowledge that this is a very high ranking for a culture that does require that specific war function to do better. And I think that says a lot about the strength of the Mycenaeans as a whole. Next up, we have the world's most wonderful noobs. It's the Nubians. These are one of two of the merchant cultures in Humankind Game's ancient era. Merchants have an affinity trait that allows them to use influence to build resource extractors and sell traded resources onto third parties. Both of these are less useful in Humankind's ancient era. You're unlikely to be doing a whole load of trade, and you're probably able to build resource extractors quite easily already with influence or production. Nice to have, but not hugely impactful. Bear that in mind when I'm reviewing the merchant cultures. Let's talk specifically Nubians though. Their legacy trait is called Golden Dreams. It provides +5 money on luxury resource deposits and +5 money on strategic resource deposits. It's a good little bit of cash for resources that you're likely going to be prioritizing building, either with influence on your outposts, which is a nice synergy that the Nubians give, or through production on your cities. +5 money, though, is not massive, and if you're after money, arguably the other merchant culture in this era will do a better job at giving it. Also, some of these other ones, like Babylonians, for example, can get to building your merchant districts quite quickly. And for that reason, I argue that +5 money is not massive, but it's still quite useful, especially because you can buy out some early districts. I think that the Nubians' real strength actually lies in their district, the Meroe pyramids. These are no Egyptian pyramids, but they're kind of close. Actually, surprisingly useful. They provide +2 industry and +2 money at the cost of the standard 10 stability. They receive that massive +3 adjacency bonus, but it's from adjacent Makers' Quarters. Makers' Quarters come online later in the era than your very early starting ones, right? Food and industry. So it can be harder to take advantage of this bonus. Something to bear in mind. You also receive +1 trader's slot on your cities, which is nice. Obviously, these guys do money, they do it well, they rely on connecting resources, but trade is less likely to be as big of a thing early on, and that sets them back a little bit, unfortunately, in the power ratings because you don't get to take advantage of their affinity trait. However, across the board they're pretty good, and their emblematic archer is a reasonably strong unit with decent enough movement, but really good range. Very, very good range line of sight mechanics going on with the Tarseti archers. something to note there. Really good early unit to use. And that is honestly just the little thing that saves them from being a C grade. I'm rating the Nubians a very, very low average. And it is so low that as we move through this video and I talk more about others, I may choose to demote them as we go. That is how on the fence I am. I'm dancing around between C and B grade. It's a really close call. But I think the fact that you can buy districts out with money in the early game, and that they do provide a lot of money, largely due to the fact that you can basically use your influence to buy resource extractors. Those resource extractors then provide you with additional money. If you build your emblematic district, the Miro Pyramids, next to some resource deposits, you can actually get quite a lot of money from them. I put in the wrong one. You can actually get quite a lot of money from them. And so for that reason, they just make it into this sort of B average grade for me. Next up, we have the other aesthete culture in Humankind's ancient era. That's the Olmecs. Reminder that aesthete cultures have basically two somewhat less useful affinity traits. Cultural Blitz lets you pay money to spread your cultural influence, that sphere of influence, and Grace means that maximum ideological proximity is available and unlocked for everyone around you. Nice to spread your sphere of influence and keep control of your civics. Important to note. More useful if you're spawning close to the enemy, not useful if you're spawning far away from them or in isolation from them. Something to remember, particularly in the ancient era where you may not necessarily even come into massive border conflict with your neighbors if you have any in the first place. However, let's talk specifically Olmecs. Their legacy trait is natural harmony, provides +1 influence on your territories. Nice enough. Not massive, but nice enough. Their emblematic unit, the Javelin Throwers, again, great ranged unit, very similar to the previous unit of the Nubians. And their emblematic district, the Olmec Head, is unfortunately actually a little bit underpowered, but it provides you with two really useful resources, influence and food. So it's a tick for what it provides, but kind of a fail grade for how it does it. It provides you with a flat +1 influence and +3 food. It's pretty good. It provides you with an additional farmer slot in the city, and of course that normal -10 stability. Its adjacency bonus is unfortunately just a +1. But it's a good one because it's influence. You get +1 influence per adjacent farmer's quarter. The strat here is obviously smash down an Olmec head and build farmer's quarters around it. It counts as a farmer's quarter as well, so you can get the sort of double adjacency thing going on. It's a good district, and this is really the best way for you to generate influence in the ancient era. However, in many cases, for example, if you play as the Egyptians, you can get your influence infrastructures online quickly and generate roughly the same amount of influence that the Olmec's districts would be providing you anyway. Likewise, if you think about the Mycenaeans, they can go to war very quickly, perhaps hoover up multiple cities, and your main plazas will be providing you with, at this point, at least +5 influence each, because you've probably got those early civics. You're probably looking at more like +15 influence on a city. Is this district really that useful then when it can only provide you with a maximum of +7 influence? And that's assuming best case scenario. More likely it's only going to be like a +3 or a +4. I argue no. I think the Olmecs are underpowered. I think that adjacency bonus needs to be more, or their legacy trait needs to provide more influence. Unfortunately, they just don't give enough influence. However, as one of Humankind's only really viable and reliable early game aesthetic cultures, I will still be placing them at a C grade. Just not quite bad enough to put them with the Hittites, but really the fact that they're underpowered and less useful across the board, I cannot rate them at that average ranking or higher. Next up on my list is the counterpart to the Nubians. This is the ancient era's second and final merchant culture. It's the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are an interesting one, and I think in general a stronger one. However, a much more specific and narrow culture. They rely on the sea, or specifically on the coast. Fortunately, in many cases, this isn't necessarily difficult to find. I can't think of a playthrough where I haven't had some coastal territories, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll always have them. It doesn't mean you'll always get to keep control of them. It doesn't mean you'll always find more, and it doesn't mean that every map that you play on will have enough for you to really take advantage of. So something to bear in mind as we go through the Phoenicians. Their legacy trait is trading pioneers. It provides +1 money per traders on your cities. Nice. Not amazing. Not terrible. +1 money is not massive. I would like to see maybe a +2 here, but it's nice enough. Their emblematic unit is unique in that it's really the only unique unit in the ocean. So if you fancy early game naval warfare, this will be the one for you. Of course, it cannot cross deep ocean tiles, so it's arguably not really that useful, and you probably won't really need it in any situation where you couldn't have made do with a normal boat, right? Yeah, it's slightly stronger, and if you end up in an early naval war, you'll win it. But what could you have not done with a normal boat? Not a lot. Therefore, not particularly useful. Their emblematic district, though, is really quite spicy. It's a harbour. The only emblematic harbour in this era, but future cultures and future eras have them too. It's called the Haven. It has -10 stability like most districts, but what it provides is very interesting. It is a full-on, far-out, hard-focused money district, +2 money per adjacent coastal water, or +2 money per adjacent lake. So there's a little bit more flexibility here. You don't just have to be on the coastline, you could also have lakes. It provides +2 money per all of those tiles, and what that tends to mean is in an ideal spot, you're probably looking at, from this harbour, getting +10 money and potentially also around +10 food, providing you've got, say, the harbour infrastructure in place, or the religious tenant, even better, that gives you food from coastal tiles. That one is really strong. If you're playing the Phoenicians, make sure you get that, otherwise you're doing it wrong. Anyway, overall, this district can provide around +10, somewhere between +5 and +10 gold, and +5 and +10 food. That makes it a really strong district, but what makes it even stronger is something that isn't even listed anywhere here. You have to know Humankind to know how to do this. You can get this district with influence. When you build it on an outpost rather than in a city, you can build it really quickly for very little influence, just like you can build those resource extractors on, say, horses. That makes this very, very strong, only because you can spam them out really quickly with influence. And to be honest, that is the only thing that lifts the Phoenicians up from a failing grade for me. It's not to say that they're bad, and I want to reiterate this again. None of these choices are necessarily bad choices. Because cultures are so different and varied in Humankind, and every game is different, every opponent, every map, every AI persona, all of these can be useful. But overall, the Phoenicians feel very underpowered in comparison to their other cultures, their neighbors that you could choose. For that reason, I nearly rated them a fail, but because you can get the Haven online very quickly in all of your outposts with influence, they do make it into a C grade, but again, not quite, say, a B or an A, because this district does need at least a few coastal water or lake tiles to be useful. And that's not always a guaranteed, most of the time, but not always. So they've got that limiting them, and they've got their relatively low power levels, and the fact that they produce nothing but money really fighting against them here. But the ability to push out those havens just lifts them up to a C ranking for me. And last but certainly not least, it is the meme of a culture on this channel. It's Zhou. Zhou is the other aesthetic culture in Humankind's ancient era, and the final one, actually, to round us out. As an aesthetic culture, need I remind you, you receive maximum ideological pressure on your neighbours, and you can use money to overwhelm your ideological pressure on a territory that you hold to really push your influence across it. Again, this is nice, maybe not as useful in the ancient era as some other cultural affinities. But let's talk what Zhou does specifically, because let me tell you, your boy Zhou has got it going on, actually. Zhou's legacy trait is harmonious thought. It provides +2 stability on all districts. That means that normally the -10 stability that is awarded from, say, a Maker's Quarter or a Research Quarter or so on and so forth, effectively becomes a -8 from now on. That's really good. Throughout the whole game, you will always find value in this. Their emblematic unit is fast and strong. 23 combat strength, 6 movement and attack range of 1. A powerful unit unlocked a bit later in the era, but a strong unit nonetheless. Their district is maybe even, and no, in fact, definitely, I would say, the most specialized niche district in the ancient era. And this does have to fight against Zhou. There is an extreme specialization here, and it revolves around mountains. Their emblematic district, the Confucian School, provides a whopping +5 per adjacent mountain. Now, throughout this tier list, I've been saying +3 is the greatest adjacency. And when I've been saying that, I've been referring to adjacency between districts, right? So it's +3 food for each agrarian district. That's an adjacency that you have direct control over in most cases. However, this one is a natural adjacency, and for that reason, really it's in a category of its own, because you can't change it, you can't build mountains. I'm sorry, you just can't. It provides +5 science per adjacent mountain, and on the right map, in the right territory, and in the right game, you can fairly comfortably get at least +3 mountains around these, so you can get around +15 science. They also innately provide +1 science and an additional researcher slot. Like most districts that provide a thing, you get +1 of that thing, and you get an extra slot for your population to do that job. That's routine. It also, though, provides +8 stability, and when, of course, you combine that with the fact that you get +2 stability on all districts, effectively it's providing +10. In that sense, it can sort of give you another free district afterwards in terms of stability, right? You'll be at net 0 if you build this and one other normal district. So it combos well with, potentially, I would argue, a Maker's district, because that'll just help your production overall. Overall, the Confucian School is incredibly strong, and it is actually the most powerful scientific district, despite Zhou not being a scientific culture. The Babylonians hold that, but only if you have a holy metric buttload of mountains. Overall, Zhou is a really interesting one, and it's actually probably the hardest one to rank in this list. For 2 reasons. Firstly, as I say, it is the most niche of all of them. It really doesn't tick the viability box particularly well, because to make the most of Zhou, you want to have some mountains. That's not to say that there aren't settings where Zhou is a good pick regardless if you just have 1 or 2 mountains. And actually, I think that's a totally viable strategy because of that really massive stability that you get from Zhou. Zhou's real downside to me is the fact that I think that they're an aesthetic culture. It makes their affinity trait, particularly in the ancient era, not that useful. And honestly, the other letdown here is that fame and star potential that I've had in the back of my mind this whole time. Having the aesthetic stars, those ace-like stars, as your main stars for the era, the ones that are going to provide you with the most fame because you're an aesthete culture, but you don't have any way to directly earn any additional influence. Yes, you have stability, which can help you passively earn more influence, but you could be earning more influence without that extra stability if you just built garrisons or whatever. Basically, with no direct way to earn more influence, other than through, say, indirectly getting it by boosting up your tech or keeping your stability higher than everyone else's, it's hard to see synergies within the Zhou culture itself. And again, they're not bad. And I'm not going to give Zhou a fail rating because I do think that the innate benefits of a reasonably strong unit, but crucially the innate benefits of districts that provide yields and stability, and their overall plus stability for the rest of the game is very, very useful. You can probably make the most of a couple of mountains to get some science too. I just think that there isn't that real core synergy that a culture like the Egyptians, even the Mycenaeans have, where every element combines well together. And for that reason, I will be ranking Zhou a lot higher than some other really niche specialized cultures, but it just can't take an S or actually quite an A tier. For me, Zhou is a bottom A, top B culture. It straddles this line. If it wasn't as specialized, or if it had even just a minor way to get influence, maybe, I don't know, the Confucian school provides +1 influence instead of +1 science and gets its science from adjacent mountains only, that would put it at A. But because it doesn't have a direct influence, I'm going to smash them in at the top end of B. And that concludes my Humankind culture tier list for the Ancient Era. I've probably ruffled a few feathers, which is not unusual for me, to be fair, but I am keen to know what you think. If you've made it to the end of the video here and you're still listening to me now, that puts you probably in the top 20% of viewers, so thanks very much. I don't need to ask you to like and subscribe because you've probably already done it. Do let me know in the comments what you think. I specifically want to know if there's someone on this list that you think, given my criteria, I should add, not yours, but the criteria that I've used, are in the wrong place. Let me know if you think I've placed someone wrong. And here at the end of the video, I will just talk for a couple of minutes about my criteria. If you want to really understand how I've evaluated them, I think this isn't just useful for understanding my mindset for how I've ranked these cultures, but more broadly, maybe it could be useful for you as players and viewers and members of my community and friends of mine to think about how we evaluate cultures going forward. This is my first tier list and it won't be the last, so I can really use your thoughts in combination with mine here. So hear me out. Basically, as I discussed at the start of the video, there were 4 key things that I was thinking about. I was thinking about power level. Overall, relative to the ancient era, how strong are these cultures? I was thinking about viability. Are the strategies and things that they give you replicable? Are they reliable? And how universal are they across gameplays and future picks, potentially? But that's a strong potentially, by the way. More on that in a minute. I also considered fame and era star potential. That's massive. How quickly can you get stars to get through to the next era? Or how much fame can you earn? And in most cases, that means how easy is it to get your main star? Egyptians as builders, how easy is it to build districts? Zhou as an aesthete, how easy is it to get influence? That kind of thing really matters. And then finally, overall usefulness within the context of the era, and considering that the ancient era is a blank canvas where everybody is on roughly equal footing. That matters, particularly if you're interested in, say, going to war. It's arguably a little bit easier when everybody is on rough footing. Of course, as well, going through this, I've assumed that you're playing on roughly an average map with, say, 70% land and Pangaea with a few islands. I've also assumed regular spawns for things like rivers and mountains, and a roughly regular difficulty. I've assumed you're playing on hard mode, basically, but this tip, it really goes across all difficulties in Humankind, to be fair. Some of the minor considerations, these were things that I was still thinking about, but that I didn't put at the front of my mind, were things like uniqueness within the era. So if it's the only builder culture, that matters, like the Egyptians. If it's the only agrarian culture, like the Harappans, that matters too. I also considered affinity actions and abilities really down to the specific detail. I considered the likelihood of you picking these cultures, but again, not very strongly. That wasn't a massive consideration for me. In fact, that really didn't influence what I picked, but I did mention it once or twice throughout because sometimes you just literally can't play them. And then 2 more things. I also considered setting up for future combos. Again, this was, and I want to stress this actually in particular, this was not a key factor for me because you may not necessarily get the culture that you want. Someone might beat you to it. Or your game might shift in ways that you can't predict and you may not end up wanting it. So for example, Zhou and the Edo Japanese later in the game both have mountain adjacencies, but I didn't consider a playthrough where I end up playing Edo Japan when I evaluated Zhou, because the differences between them, the number of eras between them, and the fact that you might not want or get to choose them, it just leaves too many variables up in the air. So I didn't consider that very strongly in any of these decisions. I think it's important for an ancient era culture tier list to consider the ancient era, right? I think that makes sense. And finally, I didn't really put a huge amount of consideration on these, but I did consider some niche situations. Again, things like, what if there was no water on a map? Or what if it was all mountains? Again, I want to highlight and stress these weren't major considerations, but things that were playing through in the back of my mind. What are the likelihood of having a mountain range? What's the likelihood of having 3 mountain ranges? How many cities am I going to have in the ancient era to make the most of these districts? Actually, that's one of the reasons why I was happy to rate Zhou at quite a high B, if not just nearly an A grade. It's still the one that I'm thinking about now as I wrap up this video, actually. Should I have moved it to A? Should I have kept it at B? I'm not sure. I think, and again, just to wrap up here on this final point, I think again it's down to the nicheness of the situation. The Egyptians are always good. The Babylonian district you can always make use of. Zhou's mountain ranges are arguably even harder than finding someone to go to war with if you're trying to replicate them at any kind of scale. Anyway, that concludes this Humankind culture tier list for the ancient era. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.